What is the current polling? There have been more and more polls in which Trump has been ahead. In fact, looking back over these, neither side is looking strong. So it's worth bearing in mind the fact that Trump is currently in criminal trials. There have also been blocks on him running in, I think Maine happened just recently, Colorado a little bit earlier. And so there are legal hurdles for him to jump. Edward Luce of the SD says it will be a very close run. Biden will squeak through, more because a narrow majority will be rejecting Trump than endorsing a Biden second term. Which kind of is the key factor in both the UK election and the US election, wherein it's a case of people voting against someone more than it is people voting for someone. Neither Biden nor Keir Starmer, who are both the sort of presumed winners of those elections, even though Biden's case is looking slightly shakier, it is very much the case that people are voting against the alternative than that people are voting enthusiastically for them. That's also not a super strong position to be in as well. And in some respects, what we're seeing now in the US is 4, 5, 6 years ahead of where we are now in the UK. Because Keir Starmer is going to win the election in the UK quite convincingly. However, he will win that election because people will be voting against the Conservative Party, which means that he might have a quite sizable majority in the House of Parliament. However, it will be a large majority, but a government that isn't necessarily popular on day one. And if Keir Starmer continues to not really try and solve any of the problems, if he is as timid as I would imagine he could be, then at the next election, it suddenly becomes a really big challenge because you're trying to run a re-election campaign on a record that people aren't really excited by. And in many ways, that's what the place that Joe Biden is in currently, is that Joe Biden got elected as a rejection of Donald Trump rather than as a super enthusiastic endorsement of Joe Biden, and is now trying to win a re-election campaign. People who are like, I guess. And in all of this, there is a real retread of, like, in some respects, it's a real retread of the 1990s, where we had politicians, like, quote unquote, triangulating and trying to just, like, look professional and don't piss anyone off, rather than trying to convince people that they could have a positive political impact. It was about, like, meeting people where they are and going, yes, I'm going to do the things you already want, and then trying to be as uncontroversial as possible. And that's kind of where we found ourselves again. However, even when you look back to that period, someone like Tony Blair, for example, was actually quite popular. Tony Blair in the UK, I imagine it was similar for Bill Clinton in the US, although I don't know that period quite as well, were popular initially, and then people sort of called on them. Whereas Joe Biden and Keir Starmer, who are kind of trying to do that 90s third way centrist politician thing, people aren't enthusiastic about that anymore. And part of that is because we don't have the same economic growth. The economy just isn't in the same place that it was in the 90s. So that kind of, like, things can only get better. If we don't do anything too radical, your life will be okay. It doesn't kind of work in the same way anymore. Like, one of the reasons that you have this really enthusiastic right in the US, partly is to do with, you know, misinformation online and all this, but partly is because people are aware that things aren't good. There is dissatisfaction with the status quo because it doesn't feel like it's necessarily serving us all very well. If you're trying to do the centrist politician thing, where your politics are kind of like, things are okay, let's continue doing this, that's difficult to win elections on. But as we saw in that polling, Trump is relatively popular. The Conservatives in the UK, very much not so. However, what both are doing is pushing the envelope politically and trying to convince voters to see the world in a different way. They are saying, like, look, here's some problems with the world, we have some answers. They're not necessarily the answers you're initially going to expect to be correct, but I'm going to convince you that they are. Whereas what Biden is doing, what Keir Starmer is doing, what the Labour Party are trying to do in the UK is to say, we agree with you on things that you already think. A great example is, a lot of people in the UK are convinced that we shouldn't be putting more money into the NHS, right? They've just been convinced by newspapers that actually we need to tweak it or reform it or whatever. What we've generally seen is that the Labour Party isn't interested in trying to convince people otherwise. It's generally taken the path of least resistance and just gone, okay, well, if you think that, that's what we'll do. And that's a really awful place to be in. One of the reasons that the Lib Dems didn't go into coalition with the Labour Party in 2010 and that they instead went in with the Conservatives partly was for the idea of like stability, that meant there was a proper government. But also, I think the Liberal Democrats would always be a bit sceptical of going into coalition with the Labour Party, because if they do that, then it means both the Conservatives and the Labour Party can go, look, if the Liberal Democrats are going to support the Labour Party, you might as well just vote Labour instead. You know, the Tories will do that in a way that is like negative, the Labour Party maybe in a way that's positive. And what will happen is the long process through which the Liberal Party has been replaced by the Labour Party will kind of be complete. However, now they've been into coalition with the Conservative Party, and that has also not been successful, right? So again, in 2010, the Liberal Democrats, the sort of centrist party I've just been talking about, went into a coalition government with David Cameron's Conservative Party, and that was like devastating for them. At the next election, they just lost loads of seats. It very nearly just completely wiped the party out. Like, I could see it being the case that potentially they just never go into coalition with anyone ever again. There have been all kinds of suggestions for some kind of like progressive coalition, progressive alliance, which I will say, anyone pushing like a progressive alliance idea in the UK, I'm always fairly sure that they're Liberal Democrats. It'll be someone who's like, it could be, you know, you can vote Labour, you can vote Green, or you can vote Liberal Democrat. And they'll be like, I'm not really part of a party. And it's always like, I think you're probably a Liberal Democrat.